What do we do when we use the same terms without realizing we're talking past each other?
We re-examine.
The single story of partnership could be a barrier to growth. What is partnership?
Scholars use many names. Our space is probably most familiar to you as students as partners or student-staff partnership.
The language startles. It invites dialogue, as metaphors do. It asks us to unlearn what we think we know.
Machinations of higher education are always governed by politics. The isms are well documented and hard to ignore. Partnership is a political process, questioning taken for granted ways, working against the grain.
Here it's different. Partnership opens up new spaces.
Spaces in the margins.
Counter spaces that challenge. Collaborative, equitable relationships in teaching and learning.
Aspirational, values-based, highlighting the collocations.
Academic selves.
Student selves.
Past selves.
Future selves.
We've all been students.
Partnership provokes us, destabilizing neat categorizations that abstract us.
Partnership makes us human again. The ambiguity of partnership opens our eyes, pushes us to accept discomfort, offers a new language, a new lens to explore, writes new rules for the classroom.
Exercise patience. Be open-minded. Fully understand.
Be playful in academic spaces.
Be joyful.
You choose who you are going to be in partnership. A way of being in the academy.
We are no longer acting. We must take seriously multiple sites of power. We navigate difficult terrain. This requires careful attention by all. I was not always met with understanding. I developed resilience through these resistances. This resilience allows me to push back.
But how do we engage in partnership meaningfully? We have to be ready for unexpected, sudden branchings. Can students truly be equal when power, privilege, and status are inscribed?
Are we unintentionally reinforcing exclusive beliefs?
I wonder about the missionaries' civilizing tones of bringing resistant students into the fold.
Does this sound familiar to you? Why do you think that is?
We persist nevertheless. The urgency, weariness, hope, and hesitation. Some of us turned inside out, all of us disheveled and disoriented.
This is a place in which we stretch ourselves, in which we rely on one another to pull us in new directions, in which we are all equally twisted up.
Aka, Mori, both to teach and to learn.
This was our understanding of partnership. Students astonished that staff seek their perspectives, staff re-energized by the thoughtfulness of students. We became cohesive, transformed by authentic encounters.
Partnerships allow us to aspire.
We listen anew to each voice, to know we would never know once and for all.
So, Lucy, should we tell our audience a bit about what it was that we just read?
It's tempting to leave them in the dark, but yeah, let me give you a little background. So Sophia and I recently published an edited collection of chapters from all around the world about student-staff partnership. And this poem called Re-envisioning Partnerships is what's called a transcribed poem or a poetic transcription, where we've taken the words of all of our authors, over 50 of them, both students and staff, and put them into poetic form to bring new light into the way that we understand what this concept is that has been taking our sector by storm over the past kind of decade or so. And Sophia, we've been asked to talk today a little bit about provocative partnerships. And the first thing that comes to mind when we think about that phrase, for me, is always power. So if I ask you to unpack that poem a little bit, what does it tell us about the role that power plays in student-staff partnerships in higher education?
I think this poem really reinforces for me the way that power cycles in partnerships. There's a cyclical way to the poem and to the process itself that we keep coming back to similar questions about agency and how we navigate our roles with one another. The poem itself goes in these circles as well, focusing first on the hope and then on the challenge and then on the hope again and then on the challenge again, backwards and forwards in this kind of constant tension. I like to think of power in partnerships in terms of feminist beliefs about power, that power never goes away. When you're in partnership, you're never going to be in a situation where a student and a staff member is at the same level or has no power together. And we wouldn't want that. But power can cycle and it can shift and move within the relationship. And I think I've been really inspired by Bell Hook's idea of mutual empowerment, the feminist idea of power as empowerment, something that moves together through us and isn't a zero-sum experience, that together we can make each other even more powerful. That's what the collaboration and kind of space and hope of partnership is for me. Lucy, I know that you examine power in your research through various theoretical lenses. What do some of those lenses tell us about the complexity of these power relationships?
Well, I think you can think of power in many different ways. The most obvious when it comes to student-staff partnership is written in the name, right? Students have a very different type of power than staff do, and that power is inscribed by institutions. So, for example, staff have arguably a lot more power than students within the academy because we're paid to be here, our time is recognised and valued, we assess students, we set the curriculum. Historically, that has been our domain as staff. But increasingly we see students keep pushing back against that and exerting a power that they have predominantly in numbers. One of the ones that I really like to think about is the UK example of Why Is My Curriculum White? Where a large amount of students got together and started what has become an international movement to push the academy to be more diverse in how it represents diversity within the curriculum. And so I think power isn't as simple as inscribed by institutional roles, but then we also have to think of the intersections. And so a theory I really like to look at student-staff partnership through is intersectionality, by Kimberly Crenshaw, a feminist scholar from the US. And Kimberly Crenshaw talks about power existing as a matrix. And there's multiple different ways that people are imbued with power based on where we're positioned in society, our gender, our race, our neurotypicality, our ability, our sexual orientation. There's loads of different ways that we can have power or not have power and be oppressed by systems that underprivilege certain of those identities. And where those identities intersect, there's a really complex confounding factor that plays in. So I know there's some great work that has been done questioning power relationships in student-staff partnership when race comes into play. So what if it's a woman of colour is the staff member and the student in the partnership is a white male? Yes, the woman has more institutional power, but societally speaking has a lot less power because of her gender and her race. So that, for me, is a really nice lens to kind of really complexify the notion of partnership and power. So I'd really like to share a poem with you. This came from Anita Akai and Rachel Geitman and myself working as students, and we did some reflection around our work as students and as women in student-staff partnership. And like the poem before, we transcribed our results in poetic form to bring new light to our voices in a way that collectively we could speak together. So this is called Workshop Partnership. I am a strong, powerful woman, confident in my abilities, entitled to my voice. I attended a workshop on partnership, a group of 3, me, an undergraduate. a female faculty member, a male senior administrator. Interrupting a conversation I wasn't invited to, trying to insert my thoughts, a minimally disruptive decision. His back actively turned to me. I really had to shove them in. They nodded, officially expressed interest. A strong, powerful woman, a slight smirk. You know how they are. A token, all that self-belief out the window. It felt like a defeat. I became a note taker. He thanked me for being part of the group.
Wow. I think many people at this conference today will recognize themselves in the discomfort that is expressed in this poem. Can you tell me a little bit about where it came from, Lucy?
I think it was a sense of frustration that the three of us had about the discourse and narratives around partnership being about empowering students, but that if it's not done authentically and those bigger intersectional effects, when they're not taken into account and really paid careful attention to in terms of the power dynamics, that partnership can actually be a really disempowering process. And so that was a combination of a number of our many experiences where we were tokenistically included as students in the room, but our voices were not valued and were not heard. And in nearly every instance where we felt that to be the case, there was usually a gendered impact intersecting there. And so trying to tease out that intersection that happens when we don't pay enough attention to power in its many forms in partnership. And Sophia, I know you have had a lot of experiences of working in partnership, like me, with between being students in partnership, being staff in partnership, being student and staff working in partnership at the same time. What are some of the other ways in which power has played out in partnership for you?
It's a great question. I think this poem and the one before and what you were sharing earlier, Lucy, about intersectionality is the role of your position in an institution is nebulous. And an interesting part of working in partnership, especially as a student and then moving on and continuing to be involved in this realm, is that you don't stay a student. And that many people who get excited about partnership go through transitions and are sometimes students and then sometimes staff and then sometimes academics, and they kind of transition through many of these roles and are multiple of these things at the same time. And now as a graduate student, I'm experiencing that very firsthand. And that liminality is an element of partnership that is really key and interesting to dissect. There's a great article by Alison Cook-Sather and Zane Smith talking about the liminality of partnership and the way that partnership itself creates a liminal space for people to exist in, where your roles still matter, but you're also taking on or operating in a wholly new role, which is that of a partner. And that itself is, I think, both a challenge for power and for the traditional dynamics that we're working in, and the social structures that never go away, but also a really cool space of hope and excitement. I think another really exciting area, you mentioned tokenization in this poem, and I think the idea of being a token as a partner is a really interesting one to me, and one that I think Hannah Goddard and Abby Flint explore in really, really exciting ways in our book when they talk about student representation systems in the UK and the ways that student reps can be partners and can act in partnership ways, but are also asked to serve as representatives for the other students. And in that sense, often at risk of being tokenized as the epitomization of a student. And that's just not the case. Like, a single student can never be a representative of every institution. So the power that that student holds is quite substantial, but then the positions that they're put in to speak for or speak on behalf of their peers and colleagues is a really challenging one, and can also put them in vulnerable situations with the institutional leaders that they're working with.
And equally comes from a place of institutions wanting to give students power, right?
Right.
And so it ties back into that cyclical nature of partnership. And I often raise questions about the notion of institutions giving students power, because if we think about Freire's work on pedagogy of the oppressed, which I know that some people have started drawing lines between partnership and kind of work, and I think that is absolutely fantastic. But he says that liberation has to come from the people who are being oppressed. It can't be something that is given, because if it's given, it can be taken away. And I definitely think that notion is really an important one to think about viewing representation systems through the lens of partnership, especially in the UK, where they're so widely and so well embedded, to acknowledge that they have great power for causing disempowerment and tokenism, but also huge power and immense power for students to self-empower. And that's the kind of language that I like to think of when it comes to partnership, is finding a place for students and staff to find mutual empowerment.
Yeah.
I agree. And I think we've got one last poem for people, if we're right.
So I wanted to end with a poem of hope and of that space of mutual empowerment and what is possible in these close, reciprocal, trust-filled, really beautiful, joyful relationships. This poem is by Abby Flint, and she published it in the Power of Partnership book in her chapter, and Between Us. Her email suggests we meet in the not-quite space of the university cafeteria to talk over coffee and cake. Here, supervisions and group work rub tables with dissections of nights out. She stands and waves. I know her by the scarf she often wears in class, blue and green geometric silk. We sit down to our uncertain task, a dance of asking, listening, carefully offering slivers of self between us, a brave space. She pulls the scarf through her fingers. Our work is built on work and small actions. A name remembered, a door held open, a palm outstretched, food shared, tiny, significant kindnesses. She lays her scarf across the table between us, an intricate path.
I literally have goosebumps. I get it every time I read the poem, because it just reminds me so much of all of the joys of partnership.
Mm-hmm.
So I think on that note, we're going to wrap up, and with that, as the title suggests, we've given you some provocations around partnership, and it's been a real pleasure. So thanks for having us.
Thank you.